But right now, some of the most brutal, beautiful, and historically devastating war films ever made are sitting on YouTube completely free. No subscription, no credit card, just raw, unfiltered cinema history waiting for you. Did you know one of these films was banned in its own country for being too honest? Sergeant York, 1941. Before there was American Sniper, before Hacksaw Ridge, there was Alvin York, a Tennessee farm boy who became the most decorated American soldier of World War I. And Hollywood turned his story into one of the most watched war films of the entire 1940s. Gary Cooper won the Academy Award for Best Actor for this role, and he absolutely earned it. Director Howard Hawks crafted something rare here, a war film that doesn't glorify the killing, but instead wrestles with the moral weight of a deeply religious man being asked to take lives. York himself, still alive at the time of filming, was reluctant to let Hollywood tell his story. He held out for years before finally agreeing, and even then, he specifically requested Gary Cooper play him. That detail alone tells you everything about how seriously this film was taken from day one. The story follows York from his wild, hard-drinking early years in the mountains of Tennessee through his religious conversion and eventual deployment to France in 1918. The climax, where York single-handedly captures 132 German soldiers, is based entirely on documented military records. This wasn't Hollywood invention. It actually happened. The film was released just months before Pearl Harbor brought America into World War II, and its timing felt almost prophetic. Audiences packed theaters. Critics called it patriotic cinema at its finest. Some called it propaganda. The truth is, it was probably both, and that tension is exactly what makes it worth watching today. War films that make you feel conflicted are almost always the ones that matter most. The Steel Helmet. 1951. Samuel Fuller made this film for less than $200,000, shot it in 12 days, and somehow created one of the most politically explosive war films ever made in America. The Pentagon refused to support it. Some politicians called for it to be investigated. And it became a cult classic that every serious filmmaker studied for decades afterward. Set during the Korean War, while the Korean War was actually still happening, Fuller had the audacity to release a film criticizing American military conduct in real time. That was almost unheard of. The film follows a grizzled, morally complicated sergeant named Zach who survives a massacre and reluctantly partners with a young South Korean orphan and a group of misfit soldiers to take a Buddhist temple. What made audiences genuinely uncomfortable was a scene where Sergeant Zach shoots a North Korean prisoner of war. Fuller didn't cut away. He didn't soften it. He let the camera sit on the moment and forced the audience to reckon with what they were watching. The Army officially stated that the scene violated the Geneva Convention, which is extraordinary when you consider this was a fictional film. Fuller was a World War II combat veteran himself, and that experience bleeds into every frame. He wasn't interested in heroic war stories. He was interested in the psychological wreckage that combat leaves behind. For a film made on a shoestring budget in under 2 weeks, The Steel Helmet hits with the force of something that cost 10 times as much and took 10 times as long to make. The Story of G.I. Joe, 1945. War correspondent Ernie Pyle was arguably the most beloved journalist of World War II. He didn't write about generals and strategies. He wrote about the enlisted men, the ordinary soldiers sleeping in mud, eating cold rations, and writing letters home that might be the last ones they ever wrote. This film is his story, and theirs. Directed by William Wellman and starring Burgess Meredith as Pyle, this is one of the most emotionally honest films to come out of the war era. It follows the Italian campaign, showing the grinding, unglamorous reality of infantry combat in ways that most studios at the time were too cautious to depict. There are no triumphant charges here. There is exhaustion, loss, and the quiet dignity of men doing an impossible job. The most remarkable thing about this film is the reaction it received from the people it portrayed. General Dwight D. Eisenhower reportedly called it the greatest war film he had ever seen. The soldiers who had actually fought in Italy wept watching it. That kind of response from the people who lived through the events being depicted is almost impossible to manufacture and nearly impossible to earn. Robert Mitchum received his only Academy Award nomination for his role as Captain Bill Walker, a commanding officer slowly being consumed by the weight of leading men to their deaths. It is a stunning, understated performance that stands as one of the finest of his entire career. The fact that you can watch it on YouTube for free right now is genuinely remarkable. 12 O'Clock High, 1949, Gregory Peck at his absolute peak. A film so psychologically precise that the United States Air Force used it as a leadership training tool for decades. Not a recruitment film, a training film for commanders. That distinction matters enormously because what this movie is really about is what prolonged command in wartime does to the human mind. Peck plays General Frank Savage, brought in to take over a bomber group in England during World War II that has been suffering catastrophic losses. The previous commander cracked under the pressure. Savage is harder, colder, more demanding, and the film watches with uncomfortable fascination as he gradually imposes his will on a demoralized unit, turns them into an effective fighting force, and then begins to crack himself. Director Henry King and cinematographer Leon Shamroy shot the aerial combat sequences using actual footage from the war, intercutting it with their actors in a way that feels completely seamless. The B-17 flying sequences are still breathtaking. Film students still study the editing of this film, specifically for those sequences. The ending refuses to give the audience the clean resolution they might expect. Savage's psychological collapse is treated not as weakness, but as the inevitable cost of what he was asked to carry. The film essentially argues that asking one person to bear unlimited responsibility for the lives of others will eventually break anyone, no matter how strong they are. In 1949, that was a genuinely radical idea for a Hollywood war film to put forward. Paths of Glory, 1957. Stanley Kubrick was 29 years old when he made this film, and it immediately announced him as one of the most dangerous directors working in American cinema. Dangerous in the best possible sense. This is the film that got him banned in France for 18 years. 18 years. Because it told the truth. Based on a real incident from World War I, the film follows French soldiers ordered to carry out a suicidal assault on a heavily fortified German position. When the assault fails, 3 soldiers are randomly selected to be court-martialed and executed for cowardice, as a way for the generals to cover their own catastrophic incompetence. Kirk Douglas plays the lawyer fighting to save them, knowing from the beginning that the verdict was decided before the trial began. The French government and French military establishment were furious. The film depicted French officers as corrupt, self-serving, and willing to murder their own men to protect their careers. France banned it entirely, and it was not shown there until 1975. Kubrick's own wife, Christiane Kubrick, appears in the film's final scene as a German girl forced to sing for a room full of French soldiers. And the moment she begins to sing, and the soldiers gradually go quiet and start to cry, is one of the most powerful scenes in cinema history. Kirk Douglas called it the film he was most proud of in his entire career. Given that Kirk Douglas made over 80 films, that statement should stop you in your tracks. Watch this one if you watch nothing else on this list. All Quiet on the Western Front, 1930. The Nazis burned it. That should tell you everything. When a political movement decides that a film is dangerous enough to physically destroy every copy they can find, that film has achieved something most cinema only dreams about. This 1930 masterpiece did exactly that. Based on Erich Maria Remarque's landmark novel, the film follows a group of young German men who enlist in World War I with visions of glory and heroism, fed to them by nationalistic teachers and politicians. What they find in the trenches destroys them, body and soul, one by one. Director Louis Milestone won the Academy Award for Best Director, and the film won Best Picture, becoming one of the first sound films to achieve that kind of recognition. When it premiered in Germany, Joseph Goebbels organized violent disruptions in the theaters, releasing white mice, setting off stink bombs, and mobilizing street gangs to terrorize audiences. The film was subsequently banned in Germany. Remarque, who wrote the novel it was based on, was forced to flee the country. His sister, who stayed behind, was executed by the Nazi regime partly as punishment for his work. The film's final image, now one of the most iconic in cinema history, was not in the original cut. Director Milestone added it during post-production, and it reframes the entire film in a single wordless moment. The fact that this film is nearly a century old and still carries this kind of emotional weight is a testament to what cinema can do when it refuses to look away. The Bridge on the River Kwai, 1957. David Lean spent nearly 2 years making this film in the jungles of Ceylon, which is now Sri Lanka. He built an actual functional bridge and then blew it up. The production nearly killed several cast members. Alec Guinness and William Holden reportedly despised each other on set, and the result was one of the highest-grossing films of the entire decade. The central tension of this film is not between the British prisoners and their Japanese captors. It is between two British officers, played by Alec Guinness and Jack Hawkins, who represent completely opposing philosophies about duty, honor, and what those concepts actually mean when survival is at stake. Guinness plays a colonel so consumed by military pride that he loses sight of the fact that he is helping the enemy. The film builds to a moment of such shattering self-realization that audiences in 1957 were reportedly left in stunned silence. The production employed over 10,000 extras, most of them local workers, and the bridge constructed for the film was an actual engineering achievement. When the climactic explosion finally happened, Lean had exactly one camera positioned correctly to capture the iconic shot. One take. If anything had gone wrong, they could not have rebuilt the bridge in time to try again. The film swept the Academy Awards, winning 7, including Best Picture, Best Director, and Best Actor for Guinness. The famous whistled march, Colonel Bogey, became a genuine pop culture phenomenon. It was hummed in offices and schools for years afterward. A war film that produced a pop hit. Only David Lean could pull that off. The Great Escape, 1963. Based on a true story so extraordinary that when it was first pitched to studios, executives assumed it was fiction. 76 Allied prisoners of war actually escaped through a tunnel from Stalag Luft 3 in 1944. The Nazis recaptured most of them and executed 50. The survivors told their story to a journalist named Paul Brickhill, who wrote the book that became this film. Director John Sturges assembled one of the most spectacular ensemble casts in Hollywood history. Steve McQueen, James Garner, Richard Attenborough, Charles Bronson, James Coburn, and Donald Pleasance are all in this film. Every single one of them is doing career-best work. The chemistry between the cast is so natural and effortless that it barely feels like acting. Steve McQueen's motorcycle chase sequence became one of the defining action set pieces in cinema history. McQueen was an accomplished motorcycle racer in real life and performed many of the stunts himself. The sequence was not in the original book because the actual event it depicts never happened. McQueen's character is a fictional composite, but it fits so perfectly into the film's spirit that audiences accepted it completely, and it has since become the scene most people associate with the film. What separates this film from other adventure films of the era is that it refuses to give you a clean, triumphant ending. The escape mostly fails. The men who organized it are mostly killed. The film ends on a note of defiant sadness that honors the real people it depicts more honestly than a happy ending ever could have. Stalag 17, 1953. Billy Wilder made this film as a sharp, cynical comedy about American POWs in a German prisoner of war camp, and somehow in doing so made one of the most psychologically astute war films ever put on screen. William Holden won the Academy Award for Best Actor for his performance as Sefton, a morally ambiguous, self-serving prisoner who trades with the Germans for personal comfort while his fellow prisoners suspect him of being an informant. The genius of the film is that Wilder refuses to make Sefton either a villain or a hero. He is a pragmatist in an impossible situation, and the film dares to ask whether the men who judge him as a collaborator are any more honorable in their own quiet compromises. That kind of moral complexity in a 1953 war film was genuinely unusual and genuinely brave. Holden initially disliked the role and felt the character was unsympathetic. He only committed fully when Wilder convinced him that the character's moral ambiguity was precisely what made him interesting. The decision paid off spectacularly. Holden's acceptance speech at the Academy Awards was characteristically brief and modest, but the industry's recognition of the performance was anything but. The film was based on a Broadway play that had run for nearly 500 performances, and Wilder opened it up brilliantly, adding visual texture and tension that the stage version could never achieve. The scene in which the true informant is finally revealed is a masterclass in misdirection and dramatic payoff. Watch the audience's reaction the first time they see it. The gasps are entirely earned. Patton. 1970. George C. Scott refused to attend the Academy Awards. He called the ceremony a 2-hour meat parade and said he wanted nothing to do with it. He won Best Actor anyway, making him the first person in Academy history to refuse the Oscar. That act of defiance perfectly encapsulates the spirit of both the man who played General George Patton and the film itself. Francis Ford Coppola and Edmund H. North wrote the screenplay, and Coppola went on to make The Godfather and Apocalypse Now, partly because of the credibility this script earned him. The film opens with one of the most audacious scenes in Hollywood history. Scott standing in front of an enormous American flag, delivering a speech directly to the camera, directly to the audience, as though the audience itself is the army being addressed. No other film had ever opened quite like that, and it immediately establishes that this will not be a conventional war film. What makes Patton extraordinary is its refusal to settle the question of whether its subject is a genius or a monster, a patriot or a reckless egomaniac. Both things are true simultaneously, and the film holds that tension for its entire 3-hour runtime without flinching. The famous slapping incident in which Patton strikes a soldier suffering from battlefield trauma is depicted with brutal honesty. The film neither excuses it nor uses it to simply condemn him. Scott's performance is so total, so physically and vocally inhabited, that it remains one of the great acting achievements in American cinema. He reportedly studied Patton obsessively for months, studying recordings, reading letters, and absorbing every document he could find. The result feels less like acting and more like channeling. Apocalypse Now, 1979. Francis Ford Coppola nearly died making this film. His marriage collapsed. His lead actor, Martin Sheen, had a serious heart attack on location. Marlon Brando arrived on set overweight, unfit, and having not read the source material. A typhoon destroyed the sets. The production went so far over schedule and budget that United Artists executives flew to the Philippines expecting to shut it down. The making of this film was itself a kind of war. Based loosely on Joseph Conrad's novella Heart of Darkness and transplanted to the Vietnam War, the film follows Captain Willard, played by Sheen, as he travels up a jungle river with orders to terminate the command of Colonel Kurtz, a brilliant and decorated officer who has gone completely rogue and is now operating as a god figure among a group of indigenous fighters in Cambodia. The film is not really about Vietnam. It is about what civilization does to the human mind when the structures that justify violence are stripped away. The helicopter attack sequence set to Richard Wagner's Ride of the Valkyries is one of the most purely cinematic moments in the history of the medium. Robert Duvall, playing the air cavalry commander who orchestrates it, delivers the line about loving the smell of napalm in the morning with such terrifying cheerfulness that it became one of the most quoted lines in film history and simultaneously one of the most chilling. Coppola entered the film at Cannes, admitting it was a mess, and won the Palme d'Or anyway. The film was later re-released as Apocalypse Now Redux, with nearly an hour of additional footage. Both versions are arguments for what cinema is capable of when a director is willing to lose everything in pursuit of a vision. All Quiet on the Western Front, 2022. Yes, this is the second adaptation of Remarque's novel on this list. No, that is not an accident. The fact that the same source material was adapted in 1930, banned by the Nazis, and then adapted again 92 years later by a German director and won 4 Academy Awards, including Best International Feature Film, is one of the most extraordinary arcs in cinema history. Germany spent decades avoiding direct cinematic reckoning with World War I from the German perspective. This film ended that silence. Director Edward Berger made a deliberate choice to strip away every trace of the romantic war film tradition. There is no glory here, no heroism in the traditional sense, no inspiring speeches. What there is instead is mud, cold, exhaustion, and the systematic destruction of young men by a political and military class that views them as expendable resources. The film's final sequence, set during the last hours before the armistice on November 11, 1918, is almost unwatchable in its fury. Men are ordered to attack and die for territory that will be abandoned by treaty in a matter of hours. The commanding officer knows this. He orders the attack anyway. The film was Germany's official submission to the Academy Awards and became the most awarded German film in Oscar history. Critics who had seen every major war film of the past century called it one of the most viscerally powerful depictions of combat ever committed to film. The cinematography by James Friend won the Oscar for Best Cinematography, and every frame of the film earns that recognition. That this film is available to watch on YouTube for free is the kind of thing that would have seemed impossible even 10 years ago. Cinema history, freely available, waiting for anyone curious enough to press play. Hollywood once spent millions trying to capture what war actually feels like. Which of these films have you actually seen, and which ones are you watching tonight? Drop your answer in the comments right now, because this list is going to start some arguments. And here is the question worth debating. If the greatest war films ever made are the ones that make war look like the worst thing humanity has ever invented, why do we still find them so thrilling to watch?